Ian Murray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Perth and North Perthshire, the Chair of the Scottish Affairs Select Committee, for bringing this debate. I think it's right for us to celebrate 20 years of devolution. Back in 1997, it was the first bill of the new Labour government that they brought forward from the manifesto. They promised to bring it early, and it was the very first bill that was presented to this House. And then we had the referendum in 1999, which gave a yes-yes vote. The only time I've ever voted yes in a Scottish referendum. The only time I'm probably likely to vote yes in a Scottish referendum that brought us the Scottish Parliament. And Donald Dewar, who's always been quoted as being the father of the House, said at that time that this wasn't about politics and it wasn't about legislation. It was about what kind of country we were, how we looked upon ourselves and how we were shown to the rest of the world. And I think we should carry that through in this debate and everything we do when talking about the Scottish Parliament. I think the big question has to be 20 years on. I was 8 when the Scottish Parliament was reconvened in 1999. I'm glad nobody in the House can do maths. Whether or not we now have, 20 years later, home rule within the United Kingdom, that's the big question, because devolution for all of us who are devolutionists and not nationalists, or devolutionists and not unionists, is that this is a journey. And the Calman Commission and the Scotland Act was always a journey about whether or not the Scottish Parliament should progress and where devolution should go as a particular journey. And there's lots to celebrate in the first part of the Scottish Parliament in terms of what it was able to do in terms of laws. I think about 280-something laws have been passed since the Scottish Parliament came into being, and I think that's something that we should be looking on as progress, because there was never an ability in this place to pass anywhere near 280 laws in a 20-year period for Scotland. I think probably 10% of that would be about accurate in terms of what would happen in the previous arrangements. We had land reform, we had feudal laws reform, we had the smoking ban, we had free personal care for the elderly, proportional representation for local government, which was hugely important, world-leading legislation in homelessness, more schools, teachers, teaching assistants, nurses, doctors, the abolition of tuition fees in Scotland. All of these things that have been better for Scottish life and really cemented the Scottish Parliament as the centre of Scottish politics and the centre of Scottish civic life. Anybody who argues that Westminster is the centre of Scottish politics and the centre of Scottish civic life has merely not moved on in the last 20 years, and you can see that from the way that the Scottish Parliament operates. But I think we now have to reflect. It gives a good opportunity to reflect on what the Scottish Parliament is delivering, and what I always thought the Scottish Parliament should be was a devolution journey that would provide subsidiarity. And everyone would have a grown-up conversation about the powers that lay at whether it was the Westminster Parliament, the EU level, whether it was the Scottish Parliament or whether it was indeed our local authorities or even local communities, and whether that idea of subsidiarity, which I firmly believe in, about where powers are best placed to lie, was being portrayed by the Scottish Parliament. I'm slightly disappointed that it's not, because all the arguments we have about powers are never about powers for a purpose. It's about powers for where powers should lie. And indeed, since the formation of the Scottish Parliament, I firmly believe that local authorities in Scotland, which used to be the vanguard of providing local services, have really turned into administrative arms of the Scottish Government. Now, that might be by design, it may be by accident, but I think it's something that we should reflect on. And councils no longer have the ability to shape the lives of their local services, not only because of significant financial constraints that have been placed on them both by this place and the Scottish Parliament, but they don't have the ability to be able to shape new policies in the way that they did, because the Scottish Parliament, certainly in the last 10 years, has sucked up power into Holyrood, rather than being a subsidiarity devolutionist Parliament back down to local governments. And I think that's something that we all, cross-party, any party, whether you're a nationalist that believes in independence or whether you're a right-wing Conservative that believes in scrapping the Scottish Parliament, everything in between, we should all have a discussion about where those powers should lie and what's the best place for them to lie, because powers aren't also being used. And it does frustrate me that we don't have an honest argument about this. If somebody stands up and principally says we are not using power A because we don't believe that that should be used for the reasons of sorting problem B, then I'll argue all day about the principle of that and whether or not that's the right thing to do, and then the voters can decide. But to say Scottish Parliament doesn't have the powers to do something when they do is really just disingenuous and undermines not just the Scottish Parliament but the whole of the Scottish political system and indeed the whole of our civic system. One example I would give, and we had a question at questions earlier to the Leader of the House, was with regards to waspy women. The Scottish Parliament has the power to do something about it. They could look at a whole range of issues. They could set up a commission, if they so wished, to look at how to deal with pensioners in Scotland, but they choose not to use that power. Now, let's argue about why you may decide not to choose it or why you want to choose it, but let's not say that there's no power to do anything about it. And section 25, 26, 27 and 28 of the Scotland Act specifically says that the Scottish Parliament has the power to introduce any top-up benefit to any reserved benefit, and pensions are a reserved benefit under section 28. We know that. So let's look at some of the big questions, Madam Deputy Speaker, of what we should do next. Intergovernmental relations is a big one, and I fundamentally agree with the member for Perth and North Perthshire. I think intergovernment relations are used as a cover for people to hide behind rather than having constructive discussions across governments. Let's look at whether or not it needs a second chamber. Let's look at whether or not the committee system works in terms of providing proper scrutiny. Let's look at the audit of the powers that have been used, the audit of the powers that haven't been used, and whether or not we should look at a subsidiarity issue of what more powers should be looked at. Let's look at the reform of the UK, whether a federal structure or a House of Lords with a Senate of the nations and regions could help deal with some of these big issues. 20 years on, we should sit and reflect honestly, cross-party, to do this. And I think that would give the last thing have to give way.
Of the Dunlop review. Isn't that the opportunity that we have now to look at how we're working at this end of the country and make the necessary adjustments so that we can make our union work better in this devolved arrangement?
Well, friend is right, because the issue of where devolution goes next isn't really a problem for Scotland, it's a problem for England. And that's why I think that when we're looking at devolution and the progress of the journey of where it goes next, we have to look at what England does, because we can't look at this in the context of the United Kingdom without dealing with England. And I think that's why a Senate of the Nations and Regions and a proper constitutional convention do it. What we don't need is a citizens' assembly that is just a talking shop for how we get to independence. That's what we don't need. We need a proper, sober assessment 20 years on. Let's celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Scottish Parliament, but let's look to the next 20 years, Madam Deputy Speaker.